Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Eugene Stepanov. I'm part of the marketing team at Perficient, and I'm very excited that you've joined us for today's webinar, in which we'll discuss the validation and business considerations for clinical study migrations. Before we cover some basic housekeeping items and move on to a brief overview of Perficient, I'll mention that we are recording today. So in the next day or so, we'll be sure to email you with information on how to access this presentation. All participants on this call will be in listen-only mode. This means that everyone is on mute. You can submit questions to the speakers at any time today by typing them in the chat feature, which is located on the left side of your screen. Please make sure you state your questions clearly and keep in mind that other webinar participants will not see who asked which question. Your questions to the speaker will be anonymously addressed as time allows towards the end of the presentation. If you have unanswered questions after the webinar or would like to request information about Perficient's capabilities, feel free to email Jessica Knowles, who is a member of our marketing team. Her information will be in the slides towards or at the end of the presentation. You can also fill out a contact form on Perficient's website if that's easier. Now that we've covered the logistics, let's just move on to a quick overview of our company. So who are we? We are a consulting firm that delivers digital experience, business optimization, and industry solutions. The work we do helps cultivate and captivate customers as well as drive efficiency and productivity. We have numerous locations across the US and Europe, as well as offshore facilities in India and China. A little bit more about Perficient. So we were founded in 1997. We are a public company that's traded on the NASDAQ, and we have about 3,000 employees or so. We've formed strategic partnerships with major technology vendors and also have dedicated solution and industry practices. One of these practices is, of course, life sciences. This graphic shows our depth of experience. You can see that we have relationships with 37 of the world's largest life science companies. I won't go into more detail about our experience on this call, but you're welcome to look at the slide more closely when you receive the link to the presentation. All right, that covers the housekeeping items. Today we have Kay Laskowski and Joe Daly, who will be chatting with you. We also have Tammy Defkin, who will stay on the line and participate in the Q&A session if time allows and if necessary. So I'll turn it over to today's presenters.
Hi, Eugene. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Kay Laskowski. I've been with Perficient since 2005. I work in the Clinical Data Management Group, and I have experience with pretty much all of the Oracle products. I have business experience with OC, RDC, TMS, Argus, AIRS. I also have experience validating those systems, and so today I will be speaking about the validation needs for a migrated study. Joe, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yep, thank you, Kay, and welcome everybody. Hello, thanks for joining this webinar. My name is Joe Daly. I have been with Perficient for about two years now. Prior to that, I've been working in clinical data management for about 20 years now, primarily working as an Oracle clinical database developer, working with OC, RDC, and TMS. I'd really like to just jump into the agenda for today. So today we're going to be talking about a very interesting topic of study migration. So we're going to talk about what is study migration. We're going to talk about reasons or situations that you may be in where you find yourself in need of migrating your clinical study data. We're going to go over through a broad, just touching upon an overview of the process of a migration project. And then we're going to focus on business considerations. And then Kay is going to elaborate on the validation considerations or, your documentation needed for a migration process. We also have some case studies that we can go over, and ultimately we'll end up with a Q&A session where we can maybe answer some specific questions that you might have on migration. Okay, so let's look at, we're talking about what is a study migration. So sometimes when, I remember way back when I faced my first migration, it was kind of like, well, what is it? Are we just, can't we just copy this, or can we just replicate this to another environment? But really that's not the case. This image here of the fish jumping from one separate tank to another really tells us the story of migration. We are going to a wholly and separate database. So although with technology today we're used to copying things, here with working with Oracle Clinical, there is no out-of-the-box functionality where we can just simply press a button and begin an export to a new database. So faced with that, Perficient had come up with a homegrown tool to address this need, which had some really good aspects, but also had some limitations. So as we took on these migration projects, we also looked to another tool called Data Pump, which is a very effective tool for transporting data into a new database environment. So what we ultimately did as we kind of refined our process was to take those good points of the homegrown tool, combine it with Data Pump, and we came up with a solution that really we think is something we're comfortable with and has worked successfully for our clients, and we're quite happy with the technical solution that we've come up with. Now we had, back in May, had a really great webinar talking about those technical aspects, or how we kind of, our solution from a technical standpoint, presented by Tammy Dutkin and our DBA, Richard Gavin. So if you are interested in finding out more about the kind of technical aspects, which won't really go into detail here, but if you do want detail on those technical aspects, we have a link here to that webinar, and it's a really great webinar if you'd like to have more information about the technical aspects. Okay, so now that we know what a migration is, what are some of the situations you might find yourself in where you need to migrate your data from one database to a wholly separate database? Naturally, archiving could be a reason, but I think another more common reason is through mergers and acquisitions. So in the pharmaceutical industry that we work in, we know that mergers, acquisitions are quite commonplace. They're just part of the business. So when these mergers happen, it's not only merging people, it's merging systems. So you can clearly see, you might have a need to move data from one database into another database. Another situation could be, let's say, if a single compound is bought or sold, and you may have studies using that compound that may be locked, but you may have an ongoing study for that compound that needs to be transferred or migrated to another environment to be finished or completed in. Another reason could be, let's say, a study is going to a CRO and you want to move that study into that CRO's environment. Or it could be that you want to go to a hosted environment, maybe that it's hosted by Perficient or another company. You want to move that or migrate that data into that separate database. Another reason, Oracle Clinical has a terminal release of 5.2 on the horizon. So we know that kind of Oracle Clinical is kind of being slowly phased out. So a lot of companies are moving to new technology. So in that situation, you may need to then migrate an Oracle Clinical study out to another database and moving forward with other technologies. So those are kind of some of the situations you might find yourself in where you may need or have a need for a migration. Okay, so this slide is basically showing an overview of what a migration project consists of. So naturally, we start with a planning stage. We gather a team from Perficient and a team from the client side. We begin to meet and plan the project. We also have the validation concern within that planning part of the project. And once we start planning the project, one major consideration could be timing of the project. When do we want to ultimately go live with this migrated data? And we start thinking about timelines, database locks, interim analysis, any conflicting deadlines that might be surrounding the study. So all that is planned out in that planning stage. Then we move on to the analysis. So we do a very technical analysis, a business analysis, and how it's going to affect the business, and the validation. And Kay is going to really dive into detail as far as the validation considerations, and I'll touch more upon the business concerns. So the next stage is development. We want to develop our process from a technical standpoint as far as how we're going to export data. We also begin to develop all of our documentation and, let's say, test cases to use during the migration. Then we move on to a dry run of those documents and informal testing. We move then along to actually doing the migration in a validation environment. And we conduct an IQ, OQ, migration qualification. And then after that, we go on to the production migration and go live with the database. Once that's completed, we complete all of our summary reports and then go into kind of a support mode. So that's just a very broad overview of the process. And as we go forward, I'll go more into the business considerations. So let's move forward and start thinking about how this may impact the business. And of course, it's going to impact the business. This is a major move. We're moving or migrating a clinical or maybe several clinical studies into a new environment. So naturally, we have to start thinking about how does that affect, let's say, downstream processes. Ultimately, with our clinical data, we want to get them into SAS data sets, do the analysis for submission. So one of the themes that you're going to hear me talk about throughout the business side of things is custom programming. So when we have an environment that we've been using maybe for several years, we may be relying on custom programming and not really realize it. That custom programming is kind of being used by standard validation procedures, derivations, extract macros, and by moving from one database to another, that custom programming may not flow over. It may fall out of scope of this migration. We have to think about what impact that would have when we go live and in the target database. So that's going to be a theme, and we'll get more into how that can impact the business side. We also want to think about integrated systems. So basically, from the source side, we're basically unplugging things, we're flowing over to the target, and we're hooking things back up when it comes to integrated systems, or we may not be. It may be so that we're not then using an integrated system on the target side. So we have to kind of think about everything that is touching our Oracle clinical data on the source side and think about what it's going to look like on the target side. So those are the basic considerations that we have to think about. Okay, and with a migration project, naturally, you might be thinking risk. What risks are involved? And again, it's really, we want to focus on those downstream processes, things that are working smoothly in our source database may be relying on custom programming that may have, and custom programming is usually complex programming. It may have existed for some years. You may have developed this some time ago, maybe by outside consulting. and that outside consulting may not be available kind of to explain to us, what it's doing, what it's really affecting, and if we were to migrate it, what is going to happen. So it's good to start thinking about that in terms of if we have to then duplicate that programming, how much is that going to cost? Can we do that? Is it really complex? Can we replace it with something more simplified? So those are the kind of risks that you might face. Another risk could be when we think about TMS and medical coding. That is a lot of work that may have been done in the source database. Is that work going to flow over? Are all of our VTAs going to come over? Are there custom dictionaries involved in this migration? Do we have to then rebuild that on the target side? And if so, do we have the resources, time, and money to effectively do that on the target side? So those are some of the risks that we want to consider kind of in this planning stage. Okay, so if we then think about the strategies, so not all migrations are the same. So one thing that we're going to think about is the subsystems. So let's talk about maybe the lab subsystem. You might have a study that may not be using the lab subsystem, and therefore for the migration, we can kind of scratch that off the list because the lab subsystem affects lots of tables. Same thing with TMS. If we can kind of remove that from the focus, then that will save a lot of time and really streamline things. So also, again, custom programming, we have to identify all of the custom programming involved. Again, TMS dictionaries, were they customized, and what work do we have to do on the target side? Another simple thing, but we have to keep in mind of all of these things is maybe company logo. Is that image file easily accessed? And to think about these things very early on is always helpful. Okay, so you might be thinking, oh, migration seems very straightforward and easy. How can we make it more fun? And that would be if we're facing a situation where we're migrating to a database that is populated. So I guess we face two kinds of situations where we're migrating to an empty database, which is relatively straightforward, versus if we're going into a populated database. So a populated database may have ongoing studies. It has, obviously, its own global library, all for the reference code lists, all the database objects are there. So naturally, we start thinking about conflicts. So we perform a conflict analysis. We want to know if anything from the source is going to bump into things in the target, and we then want to address all of those conflicts. So what we end up with is our DBA provides an Excel spreadsheet detailing all of the conflicts involved, and we do an initial analysis of those conflicts and see how far-reaching they are, what studies they are affecting, and then we have to start thinking about rules of how to address these specific conflicts. Now, we usually don't go with a blanket approach, whereas we just say, well, everything from source is going to overwrite or anything like that. It's conflict by conflict. So each conflict can be addressed in its own way. And it could be that going back to custom programming, let's say if we have a validation procedure that's coming over, we may want to retire that temporarily until custom programming can be duplicated on the target side. So we then collaborate with the client to come up with the rules for addressing all of these conflicts. Another thing that we produce is what we call a post-migration cleanup document. So this document basically has all of the manual tweaks that we might have to do in the target side to make things work. Again, that example of an edit check or a validation procedure flowing over to the target that's relying on custom programming, we then want to retire that so that our batch validation does not result in a failure status because of that particular procedure. And there's other examples here. We have DVGs that may be affected, TMS domains that may be affected, reference code lists, and those tweaks may be manual things that we'll do on the target side. And we develop that post-migration cleanup document to house all of those manual tweaks. Another part of the process is informal testing. So this basically is when we get a test environment and actually do a test of the migration, a test import of all of the data. This is really helpful to go in and focus on some of the hot spots of OC functionality that's typically affected by migration, or could be affected by migration. And one of those things is naturally the batch validation. We want to see that everything's executing, and if it's not, we can then pinpoint some of those procedures that are causing failures. We also run the extracts, things like generating a graphic layout, making sure all the templates are there and in place. So this informal testing is really helpful because then it kind of drives how we define the testing going forward. So very helpful step. So that leads us to creating what we call the Migration Requirement Specification, or MRS. So this is a document that we collaborate with the client, and this really defines the level of detail of testing that we're going to do for the migration. It lists basically everything we're going to test to make sure that that migration was successful. So we collaborate with the client, and it's really important to have team members at that point that really know your Oracle clinical system from a technical standpoint. Also, it's really helpful to have, and it might be the same person, that knows the clinical study data as well, so that they can think about and have in mind custom programming, database objects, special considerations as far as the design of studies. Very helpful with the MRS definition. So once we have all of our requirements set, we then begin to develop what we call a migration qualification test suite. So this is actually a two-part document. It's a source piece and a target piece. So basically, we're just going to compare that the data in the source has migrated over successfully and as expected to the target. And the way we do that, I'll get into that, I think, in the next slide. But the other testing documents that we have in place is obviously our IQ. We run an IQ on the validation and production instance. But it could mean that we, for particular projects, we have other documents that we generate. One could be if custom user roles are being used for the target environment. We have a checklist to make sure that those roles are established and working properly. But we also have maybe supplemental IQs. So that could be an example would be if we have a new character set being installed in Target, we want to make sure that that character set is functioning as expected. So those are some of the documents that we produce. So talking about the migration qualification, like I said, it's basically a comparison between source and target and a documenting of that testing. So initially we had relied on screen captures. So we would go into OC and RDC and collect screen captures and then simply compare them and make sure that they are the same data has flowed over as expected. That was a little bit troublesome, and we kind of modified our approach, and now we go with more SQL listings, a kind of a combination of SQL listings and screen captures. the thing to think about when we think about executing the migration qualification on the source side is access restrictions. So it could be another company which may not be terribly open to Perficient coming in and accessing the production database and performing this migration qualification. So it could be that they may not want us to do that remotely. They may want us to come on site. So we have to think about planning site visits and how to execute this source migration qualification test suite. So some of the basic SQL listings that we do could be, let's say, your DCIs for a study. We want to get totals of each status, active, provisional, retired, and then compare that to the target after migration and make sure all those totals line up. Okay, so that brings us to the production cutover. So when we start thinking about going live after migration and all the testing is complete, just in the planning and pinpointing, and it usually occurs during a weekend so that we can go live on that coming Monday, we want to think about, I think I mentioned before, like deadlines for that, if it's a particular study or studies that we're migrating, any interim analysis or database locks. We want to keep and be mindful of those locks and plan that cutover such that it does not impact any of those deadlines. That's very important. So once the production cutover is done, again, we do our summary reports of all of our testing and then kind of move into a support mode. So that's basically an overview of some of the, what we do in planning for the migration, some of our documentation that we use to get to that production cutover. At this point, I will pass it over to my colleague, Kay, and she will go more into, like I said before, the validation standpoint and what's involved from that standpoint. So, Kay, I would guess the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Joe. So Joe has been talking about the glitz and glamour of the migration, and now I'm going to pull it back into the, I think he got the Hollywood section, and I'm going to pull it back into the Midwest. This is what we need to get done to make sure that we're covered in any kind of audits. We're going to talk about the validation considerations. As Joe pointed out in that one slide with the arrow that showed the process all the way through, QA is really involved from the get-go. And the reason they do that is because QA really needs to have a good understanding of the project, because they need to do their analysis and find out, you know, how that fits into the SDLC for the company, how what SOPs we need to follow, what documents we really need to have for that project. The documents might be different depending on, as Joe said, that you could be importing into a completely empty database that would have a different set of documents than let's say, migrating into a system that's already been in production and already has data in it. So QA needs to be involved from the very beginning, and they need to talk to all of the people involved. And they really do solicit information from IT to find out what the technical side is going to happen, what's happening on the technical side. They also solicit input from the SMEs to find out what's going on the business side, and that way they can determine really what needs to be put into place for this system. So I'm going to say this many, many, many times throughout my section of the presentation. I'm going to go through what we do at Perficient, but our SDLC and our SOPs are going to be similar to yours, but different. So it's really important that you follow your SOPs on any of these, any kind of business migrations you do, any kind of validations you do. Follow your SOPs. This is just an example of our SOPs. And our SOPs, our SDLC calls for a validation plan, and each phase of our validation will have its own summary. But our validation plan is really our overarching document that really shows what we're going to be doing. It shows why we're doing things, why we're doing the validation we're doing, what we're doing, who's going to be doing it. Under that umbrella, we have the spokes. So we have the little spokes of the umbrella, and each one of those phases of validation will have its own protocol. We call for an individual summary report for every phase of testing. So for the installation qualification protocol, we would have an installation qualification summary report. For the operational qualification, we would have a summary report for that. Migration testing, we would have a migration summary report. And then at the end of the project, we have an overall validation summary report that summarizes all of the testing. Depending on, and I mentioned this earlier, so depending on what's involved in this, you can either go with the validation plan, or you might need to go with the change plan. And I'll cover that in the next slide. So again, remember, just follow your SDLC. So validation plan versus change plan. When do we need what? A validation plan is going to be if, let's say, a new installation. You've never used Oracle Clinical before. You've got a new installation. We're going to put together a validation plan because you do not have an existing database to change. You've got something that's new, never been validated, so it's going to require heavier validation. And it's not changing anything. It's brand new. If we're migrating into the new database, a validation plan would also be necessary if during the process of migration we're also upgrading the system. And here's where there's a little bit of gray area. You don't always need a validation plan when you're upgrading. That could be a change plan. It really depends on how the upgrade's going to go, and if you are changing a platform, you're changing hardware, that would go with a validation plan versus an upgrade that is on the existing infrastructure. Then you would need a change plan. So again, that's why it's really important for QA to understand the entire scope of the project so that they can make these determinations and get the right documents in place. So the change plan is just really, the documents both contain similar information. The validation plan is just it's a different format, and it's a little bit more detailed. So when you're creating the validation plan, and these slides really are geared toward a validation plan, not a change plan, but I can, kind of step back once we get to different slides and show you where the differences would be. For the most part, again, they're different formats, but the data is really going to be the same. It's going to be, and I'm going to take you right back to journalism school right now, the 5 W's. So what are we going to do? We're going to do this migration. Who's going to be doing this? Well, it's going to be the IT, it's going to be data management, it's going to be QA, and this is what those people are going to be doing. Where is this going to happen? Well, we're going to test in validation, and then we're going to roll it into production. We're going to do this test in production. So it's again, follow the who, what, when, where, why. When is kind of optional. I've seen people put in a very high-level project plan in their validation plan. I've seen them reference an external project plan, or I've seen them not put anything in at all. So it really depends on what your templates are, basically what your templates are and what data you want to go in there. But you really do need to have all of the other information present in the validation plan. We rely heavily on templates because we put together these documents. It almost seems daily, but we do put together a lot of these documents, and so we rely heavily on templates. And if you look at this template, you see there's some housekeeping information. So Section 1, revision history, Section 5, definition of terms, 10 reference documents. Those are all really to make sure you're reading the right document and make sure you've got enough information to understand the terminology in the document. All of the other sections really support that 5W. You've got intended audience and roles and responsibilities to show you the who. You've got the scope and the, again, roles and responsibilities to do the what. Purpose is why. So all of these sections will really support everything we're doing, and why we're doing things, what we're doing, who's going to be doing it, where it's going to be done. All of these sections really do support that. Our SOPs actually cover who is going to be responsible in the validation plan creation and approval. So, it's pretty easy for us to pick up our SOP and go, oh, well, this is who's going to be the approver on the document, and this is who we're going to review. Basically, it follows, there's a QA person or their designee will author the document. It goes out for a very wide review, and that review, it could be very wide. It could be one person from each of these. It really depends on the project. But at the minimum, it's going to be the project manager, IT or the installer, the system owner, the stakeholder, QA on both internal Perficient side and the client side, and the SMEs. And I said this earlier, it's really important to involve QA up front, and it's really important to involve basically all of the key players up front, because you don't want to get all the way through your process and not have included, let's say, the client QA, and then at the very end of the project, the client QA comes on board and says, oh, we need to go and backtrack and do all this retesting because this does not fit what our SOPs say. Or, so it is really important to have those discussions up front and to include everybody who is going to have any input on this project. I do say in the author, we do, in our SOPs, we actually allow for designees. So if the QA manager, for instance, is not available, a QA designee can be the approver for the document, or a QA designee can be the author for the document. And we do that because, as a consulting firm, many of us are traveling, and many of us are traveling a lot, and we don't want to have a bottleneck. So we do want to have some formal mechanism for allowing an approval in our place. So we do have that in our SOPs, that we can designate a person to do this other thing for us. At the end of the process of the review, we do have the approval page on our validation plan where the approvers will have to sign off. And that is a smaller group of people. That's the author, the system owner, the stakeholder, and QA. And we do almost always include internal QA and client QA on that sign-off, just because, again, we don't want to get to the end of the process and have their QA go, well, I kind of looked at it, but, we really need to do X, Y, and Z. We want that sign-off ahead of time so that they know exactly what we're doing. So earlier I said that the validation plan is really a big umbrella. So that is really a high-level overview of the project and what we're going to be doing for the project. Under that umbrella, you're going to have different spokes, I guess I could say, and each of those spokes of the umbrella would be a phase of qualification testing. So you've got, and each of those phases of qualification testing will have a unique protocol. So the protocol would, you would have an IQ, you might have MQ, as Joe was talking about, you might have OQ, PQ. It's going to be defined by the project itself. But each of these protocols is really a more in-depth look of the validation that's going to be going on. So where the plan was the who, what, when, where, why, the protocol really is it really focuses on the what and the how. So this is what we're going to do. installation qualification protocol will include a system diagram to show what the server names are, what the structure is. It'll detail in depth what the whole process of the migration is. Is there going to be a database clone involved? How is the migration going to be imported? It is a very in-depth of what we're going to be doing. And it also has a big section about how. So how we're going to test. So when we have a test script, how are we going to execute that test script? How are we going to document that test script? If we find an anomaly, how are we going to document that? So it is a very detailed set of instructions that drive the testing. And again, I've said this before, the different protocols are going to be needed for each phase of the qualification, but each phase might be different depending on the actual project. So, for example, if we have a brand new database, somebody has never used OC before, but they need to install a new database and then migrate this study over, you're going to need a full OQ and possibly what we do is for the OC, because it's not that customizable. We actually do a hybrid OQ-PQ, but you might need that. If it's a very straightforward migration with no business changes at all, you might just need the IQ and the MQ. So depending on the project, it's going to drive what protocols you need. The protocols, though, here are some examples: the installation qualification, operational qualification, and migration qualification. Each one of the protocols will have very similar sections, but there will be certain differences. So each of the protocols will have very detailed instructions on what we're going to test and how we're going to test. So it will reference a validation suite. It will reference how the tester will execute, how they'll document. It'll show examples. So each one of the protocols will really have that same information. It's different information depending on what phase of the project it is, but it really is, the content is really similar. The installation qualification is designed to test a new database install or an existing database clone or an upgrade. It really is, if something is going on with that database regarding installation, cloning, upgrading, we want to get in there and we want to do some testing, and we want to make sure that testing is fairly quick. It's usually less than a day. It's a very small subset, or very small set of test cases that really hit the high-level functionality. So we'll add a record, we'll save a record, we'll add a reference code list, we'll put in a study, we'll run a report server job, we'll run a P-sub job. So we just really go through and we hit that pretty high. So this installation qualification protocol really describes that test suite and what we'll do with that test suite. We also have the DBA create installation logs, cloning logs, upgrade logs, and that is really a step-by-step process of what they're doing. So, it gets down to the level of, they log on as system. They execute this. And it is that log so that it is a duplicatable document, so that if any, you can see what happened, but you can also use that to then install or upgrade, or you can use that as your map when you're doing the production upgrade. And all of the protocols also reference the summary report. I said earlier, each of your protocols will have its own separate summary. So the IQ protocol will have an IQ summary. Each one of the protocols will reference that summary. So, and again, all these protocols are very similar. They use the same base template, and then they kind of branch out depending on what phase we're in. The installation protocol would have more of what was going to happen in installation and the overview of the system diagram. The operational performance qualification protocol, and those can be separate. In our case, we kind of put those together as a hybrid. But those are very much more specific. And again, same sections of the protocol. You're going to have, we are going to execute this test cases. We're going to come up with this documentation. This is how we're going to do it. But it really has the test cases for this is a test case suite that's then mapped to functional or user requirements or migration requirements, as Joe was talking about. So the operational qualification protocol itself is very similar to the IQ. The content of the operational qualification testing is quite different. It's very detailed. It's very thorough. It tests the functionality. And again, depending on the project itself, you might have an operational qualification performance qualification testing that goes weeks and tests all the functionality if this is a brand new system. If this is something like migrating into an existing in-production database, you might have something the business users have come up with that they want to really make sure works when, and they want an official test on it after the migrations happen. So, depending on the project, this could last weeks, or this could last a day or days, really. And then the migration qualification protocol, this is really designed to test the study migration itself. It tests the study objects and all the study data, so all the meta objects, all the global library information. It does test to make sure that that's all intact. And again, similar format, you're going to, in the protocol, point to the different test suite. You're going to explain how to execute those tests, and it references the migration summary. This is kind of kind of stands alone a little bit, the user acceptance testing. So depending on your SOPs and your company, user acceptance testing can be formal. It can be considered your PQ, so it needs the PQ protocol. It needs the different test cases. It's a more formal approach. Or if you've got the OQ-PQ hybrid, the user acceptance testing can be really a little bit more, less formal. It can be very informal. It can be just a matter of referencing in the validation plan a paragraph that says the users will be doing user acceptance testing, and they will provide a paragraph that will be included in the validation summary report. So it could have test cases, it could have a formal process, or it could be just users logging on, making sure they can access the study, make sure that they can do anything that they've done up until then that's related to their job. So it really just depends on your company, your SOPs. I've seen companies not even do user acceptance testing. So, it really, like I said, it depends on your SOPs. So Joe touched on the development of a test suite, and he talked about the requirements, and requirements are really a broad description of some kind of specification. So you either have user-defined specifications, which come about for the migration, so they'd be migration requirements, or you've got the functional requirements that are really designed based on the vendor supplied documentation. The functional requirements are more in depth. They'll test nuts to bolts, everything, from start to finish. The user requirements are a little bit more specific, so they're specific to each company. So a user in company A might have the need to test one thing, and company B, they don't even use that, so they don't want to test that at all. So it really depends on the company and what they want to do. And that's why meeting with the client up front and hearing their needs, having requirements gathering sessions, that's always very important. The requirements then are really the cornerstone. So you start out with the requirements, and they could be user-defined, they could be functional, they could be related to migration. Those are the cornerstone. They are specifications that tell you what you want the system to do. So they are the end point, really. They're really the beginning. That's what a cornerstone is. So they're the cornerstone, but they drive the entire process. The requirements then go into a trace matrix, and the trace matrix is designed to look at the requirement and then spec out test cases that you're going to need that are going to test that requirement and make sure that requirement's met. So the initial spec of that trace matrix, the initial spec of that test case, that can change 20 times between the time you initially create it and the time you finish actually the suite, because you start out with the spec, because that will be your roadmap then. Then once you get into actually the test case development, you might throw in an extra test case. You might say, I can combine these two. I don't really need this one because this does the same thing. So, then that's going to go, you're going to go back to the trace matrix and you're going to update that. So, though it is different set of opinions here, but my opinion is to start with the trace matrix because you're speccing it out, and that's really what you should do. But don't finalize that document before you've got a fairly cemented draft of the test cases, because that document changes throughout depending on what you're doing in the test cases. Then the test cases are really very in-depth. They're a detailed step-by-step instruction of what you're going to do to actually test that particular requirement. And I see we're kind of closing in time, so I'm going to step it up a little bit. Here is an example of our requirements document along the top. You see there's a requirement circled in red. That requirement then goes into the trace matrix, which is on the left. Then you spec out the test case, and then if you see the gold arrow over it, the test case has that same objective. And so it really, like I said, the requirements, you start with the requirements, it drives the whole process. We've talked about the different types of testing, the IQ, OQ, PQ. We'll have migration. Really, it's the IQ is designed not to really have requirements. You really just hit the system very fast to make sure everything's ready for you to go on to the more in-depth testing. OQ, PQ is more in-depth. It does require the requirements in trace matrix, and that, like I said, could be many, many pages if you're doing a fresh install. It could be 1 or 2 pages if you're just doing some business requirements. Migration testing also will require the trace matrix, and those requirements might be, as Joe said, it might be something like row counts in the source database match the row counts in the target database. It could be this particular reference code list value was changed to accommodate the migration. It could be, they're very high level, they're very much specific to the migration. We've also got integration testing, and the integration testing may or may not require requirements in trace matrix. It might actually be a part of the migration testing. It really is one of those play it by ear kind of things. It's not set in stone. You might not even have any integration testing. It really depends on what the client's needs are if they have something integrated with OC. Joe talked about the user role testing a bit, and I think that is that's very specific to certain clients also. So if you're using OC out of the box, you have not adjusted the permissions for the user roles, that would not be necessary. If the source, if or the source or the target, you've got some custom roles created, you've modified access for people's roles, you would want to do some user role testing, and that could be as simple as getting a spreadsheet from the client that says what they're supposed to be and looking at the system and comparing that. It could be easy like that, or you could make it more difficult, but either way it's going to be testing the same thing. And I said this earlier, each of our protocols, so each phase of testing will have at least one execution summary report. So protocol execution summary report, we'd have one for OQ, we'd have one for migration. The caveat here is the IQ protocol could have 2 summary reports depending on your processes. The installation qualification protocol will be most likely executed in the validation instance to make sure that you're ready to do your validation. And then it'll be executed again in production when you're doing the production cutover, because you do want to make sure there's no surprises. So you do want to hit that new production cutover pretty fast and pretty hard with your IQ testing. In that case, you'll have a protocol execution summary report that summarizes the validation in val, and then you'd have a second report that would summarize the testing in prod. This is just an example of our table of contents, and again, we've got some housekeeping information up until section 6, and then we go into documentation anomalies, discrepancies. The execution summary report really just is a map of what happened in the execution. So how many test cases you executed, how many passed, how many failed, what anomalies you found, what discrepancies you found, what you're going to do about those. It really is a summary of what the testing was. And then at the end of all of the successful all of the, let's just say all of the validation testing, all of the protocol execution, you've got all of the summaries signed off. Then you'll do an overall validation summary report, and that really takes pieces of each of those documents and summarizes the entire validation. And if you see the table of contents, it's very similar. You've got the results, you've got the anything that's happened during the execution. The only thing that's really a big difference is Section 9 is a summary statement, and that really is the summary of validation for the system. So it can be just a paragraph that says this system is now validated and is ready for production use. And now I don't think we have time for case studies. I'm going to turn it over to Eugene, and he can lead us through Q&A.
Sure. So thanks, Kay and Joe. So we actually don't have time for the case studies or Q&A. So for those that ask questions, we'll follow up separately via email. You can review the case studies in the presentation that you'll receive in the next coming a couple of days. So you can take a look at those. I'd also like to say if you do have immediate needs or want to get in touch with us, you can follow up with Jessica Knowles. Her email is on this slide right here in front of us. You can also fill out the contact form on Perficient's website. I do also want to mention that we have a webinar that we're hosting with Oracle on August 10th, and it's the focus is going to be focused on Oracle Data Management Workbench, so that's DMW. Feel free to register. You can find the link on our website. That brings us to the end of the hour. I'd like to thank everybody for joining today. We hope that you found this information helpful. And I'd like to thank once again our presenters for spending some time with us today. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great rest of the day.